What if the only thing standing between you and the life you were meant to live is the story you keep telling yourself about why it is not possible yet? What if the walls around you are not made of stone or steel, but made of fear, made of habit, made of the quiet voice inside you that says you are not ready, you are not smart enough, you are not from the right place, you do not have the right connections? What if that voice has been lying to you for years, and you have been listening to it every single day without questioning it even once? That question is uncomfortable. Good. Uncomfortable questions are the beginning of real change, and real change is exactly why you are here today. Welcome to English to Inspire, the channel where every story is a lesson, every lesson is a mirror, and every mirror shows you something you already knew but were not ready to face. Here, you practice your English, and you train your mind at the same time, because language and courage grow together, and you cannot truly have one without the other. If this channel speaks to your soul, if it pushes you, challenges you, and makes you feel something real, then take 1 second right now and subscribe, because what is coming next will change the way you see everything. Today we are going to talk about a woman who had every reason to give up and 0 reasons to keep going. At least that is what the world told her. And yet she became one of the most important human beings who ever lived on this planet. Her name was Marie Curie, and she was a woman born in the wrong country, in the wrong century, to the wrong gender, according to the world around her. And she took every single one of those limitations and turned them into fuel, into fire, into force. She did not come from wealth. She did not come from power. She came from pain, from loss, from a country that had been erased from the map by its own neighbors. And she carried that pain quietly inside her chest like a secret engine that never stopped running. You need to understand something important before we go deeper into her story. Marie Curie was not lucky. She was not gifted in the way people use that word to dismiss hard work and make themselves feel better about their own inaction. She was disciplined in a way that most people will never experience, focused in a way that most people will never choose to be, and hungry in a way that comfort slowly kills in most of us before we even realize what we have lost. She is not a story about talent. She is a story about what happens when a human being refuses, absolutely refuses, to let the world define the size of their life. Think about that for a moment. The world around you right now is constantly trying to define the size of your life, telling you what is realistic, what is practical, what people like you normally achieve. And the question you must ask yourself tonight, honestly and without mercy, is whether you are listening to that world or whether, deep inside you, there is still a small fire burning that has not gone out yet. Because the story of Marie Curie begins with exactly that kind of fire, burning quietly in a little girl in a country that did not even have its own name on the map. Maria Skłodowska was born on November 7th, 1867, in Warsaw, Poland. And the first thing you need to understand about that moment in history is that Poland did not officially exist. The country had been divided and consumed by 3 powerful neighboring empires, Russia, Prussia, and Austria. And the piece of Poland where Maria was born was under Russian control, which meant that speaking Polish in school was illegal, that celebrating Polish culture was dangerous, and that simply being who you were, where you were, was already an act of quiet resistance. She was born into a world that wanted to erase her identity before she even had a chance to build one, and that fact shaped everything about who she would become and how she would fight for the rest of her life. Her father was a teacher and a man of science who loved knowledge, the way other men love gold, and he passed that love to his children like a sacred inheritance that no empire could confiscate. Her mother was a woman of extraordinary strength, who ran a school for girls and managed a household with the kind of quiet dignity that leaves a permanent mark on a child's soul. But life was not gentle with the Skłodowski family. Maria lost her older sister Zofia to typhus when she was still very young, and then, even more devastatingly, she lost her mother to tuberculosis when she was only 11 years old. And those 2 losses arrived like hammer blows to a child who was already learning that the world was not a safe or merciful place. What grief does to a person depends entirely on what that person chooses to do with it. And Maria chose, even as a child, even in the middle of pain that would have broken many adults, to study, to read, to learn, with an intensity that seemed almost frightening to the people around her. She finished her secondary schooling at the top of her class, winning a gold medal, and then discovered something that would define the next chapter of her life, with a particular cruelty that the world reserves for people with great ambition and difficult circumstances. The University of Warsaw did not accept women. The dream was real. The door was locked. And the question was simple. What do you do now? Most people, when they meet a locked door, turn around. They call it wisdom. They call it being realistic. They tell the story later as proof that the dream was never truly possible, and they find a way to make peace with a smaller life. But Maria Skłodowska did not turn around. She found a crack in the wall, and that crack was called the Flying University. A secret, a legal network of Polish professors and students who met in private homes, rotating locations constantly to avoid detection by Russian authorities, teaching everything that the official system refused to teach, in the language the empire had tried to silence. She did not wait for permission. She created her own education in the shadows. Here is what that means for you today, right now, wherever you are sitting or standing or lying down listening to this voice. The system around you will not always give you what you need. The doors that should be open for you will sometimes be locked, not because you are not worthy, but because the system was not built with you in mind. And the question that Marie Curie answers with her entire life is this one. When the door is locked, do you stop, or do you find another way in? She was 19 years old, studying in secret, in a country that had been erased, and she had already decided her answer. There is a kind of love that the world rarely talks about, a love that does not ask for flowers or promises or comfort, but instead asks for time, for patience, for sacrifice so deep that it costs you years of your own life. And Maria Skłodowska knew that kind of love before she ever set foot in a real university. She had a sister named Bronya, older than her by a few years, and Bronya had the same hunger, the same fire, the same desperate need to learn and to become something beyond what the world around them was willing to allow. Both sisters dreamed of studying in Paris, at the Sorbonne, one of the greatest universities in the world, which at that time accepted women when almost no other serious institution would. But Paris was far away, and education cost money. And money was exactly what the Skłodowski family did not have enough of. So they made a pact. The kind of pact that only people who truly love each other are capable of making. The kind that requires one person to step back so that the other can step forward. The agreement was this. Maria would work as a governess, a live-in teacher for wealthy families in Poland, sending as much of her small salary as possible to Paris so that Bronya could study medicine. And then once Bronya finished her degree and began working as a doctor, she would send money back to Maria so that Maria could go to Paris and study too. It was a simple plan built on an enormous amount of trust, an enormous amount of patience, and an enormous amount of delayed pain. Maria began working as a governess when she was 17 years old, and the years that followed were among the hardest of her life, in ways that had nothing to do with physical difficulty. She was brilliant. She was burning with ideas and questions, and an appetite for science that had no outlet. And yet, every single day, she had to smile and be patient and teach other people's children their letters and their numbers, while her own dreams sat quietly in a corner of her mind, waiting. She fell in love, during those years, with the son of the family she worked for, a young man who loved her back, but whose parents considered a poor governess, completely unacceptable as a future doctor. And that rejection, quiet and cruel and based entirely on class, added another layer of pain to years that were already heavy. She wrote letters to her father during those years. Letters full of doubt and exhaustion and the kind of loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from being surrounded by people who cannot see you clearly. And in one of those letters she wrote something that should stop you cold if you are honest with yourself right now. She wrote that she had lost the ability to hope, that the future felt abstract and far away, and that she was beginning to wonder if the sacrifice was real, or just a story she was telling herself to survive the present. And yet, she kept sending the money. She kept showing up. She kept the promise even when hope had temporarily left the building. Because commitment is not about how you feel on the best days. It is about what you do on the days when feeling has gone completely quiet. 5 years she worked like that. 5 years of small rooms and other people's children and dreams, deferred, and a fire kept alive on almost nothing. And then Branya wrote to her from Paris and said the words Maria had been waiting years to hear. "It is your turn now. Come." Those 3 words, earned through 5 years of invisible sacrifice, are a lesson that no classroom can teach you as powerfully as that story does. Because the question sitting inside those 5 years is a question about you, about the promises you have made to yourself, about the sacrifices you are willing to make, not for a week or a month, but for years, silently, without applause, without guarantee. Because you believe that what is waiting on the other side is worth every single quiet and painful day. Paris in the 1890s was the most intellectually alive city on the planet, a place where ideas moved through the streets like electricity, where scientists and artists and philosophers collided in cafes and laboratories and lecture halls, and where the future felt like something you could almost reach out and touch with your bare hands. Maria Skłodowska arrived in that city in November of 1891. She was 24 years old. She had waited 5 years for this moment, and she stepped off the train with almost no money, almost no French, and an amount of hunger and determination that was completely invisible to everyone around her but absolutely enormous on the inside. She enrolled at the Sorbonne, registered herself under the French version of her name, Marie, and walked into a world that was finally, for the first time in her life, willing to let her through the door. But Paris did not welcome her with warmth and comfort. The reality of her life in that city was brutally simple and brutally hard in ways that she had not fully prepared herself for. Even after years of difficult living in Poland, she rented a tiny attic room in the Latin Quarter, so cold in winter that the water in her wash basin would freeze solid overnight, and she had so little money that there were weeks when she ate almost nothing, surviving on chocolate and bread and the kind of focused denial that comes when the mind is so completely consumed by a goal that the body's complaints become background noise. She fainted from hunger at least once during those years, collapsed in the middle of her studies, and had to be taken in temporarily by Bronya and her husband to recover her strength before returning to her room and her books. What she did in those conditions is the part of the story that most people skip over because it is not glamorous and it does not make a good short video. But it is the most important part, the part that actually explains everything that came after. She studied. That is it. That is the whole story of those years in Paris. She woke up in a freezing room. She put on every piece of clothing she owned to stay warm, and she studied with a concentration so complete and so total that her professors began to notice her and then began to be genuinely astonished by her. In 1893, she earned her degree in physics, finishing first in her class, and the following year, she earned a second degree in mathematics, finishing second in her class. And both of those facts are so extraordinary given the conditions she was living in that they should make you stop and think very carefully about the excuses you are currently carrying around in your pockets. Because here is the truth that Marie's years in that freezing Paris attic are trying to tell you, a truth that is inconvenient and uncomfortable and absolutely necessary for you to hear. You have more than she had. You almost certainly have more warmth, more food, more access to information, more tools, more comfort than a young woman studying in a frozen room in 1892. And yet something is still stopping you. And that something lives not in your circumstances, but in the conversation happening inside your own head every single morning when you wake up and decide what kind of day you are going to have. Marie did not have the luxury of waiting for perfect conditions because perfect conditions were never coming. And the moment she accepted that, truly accepted it in her bones, was the moment she became unstoppable. She had come to Paris to learn, and she was learning. But what she could not have predicted was that Paris was also about to give her something she had never expected and had not been looking for. Something that would change not just the direction of her work, but the entire shape of her life. Something that would prove that the greatest partnerships are not built on similarity or convenience, but on a shared and almost irrational devotion to the same impossible question. And that thing, that unexpected gift waiting for her in the laboratories of Paris, was a quiet, brilliant, deeply unusual French physicist named Pierre. There are people you meet in life who feel less like strangers and more like answers. People whose presence in your life makes something that was always slightly out of focus suddenly become completely clear. And Pierre Curie was exactly that kind of person for Marie Curie, although neither of them would have described it that way at first, because both of them were far too serious and far too absorbed in their work to use romantic language about anything. Pierre was 35 years old when they met in 1894. Marie was 26, and the introduction happened through a mutual friend who thought that Pierre, who had laboratory space, might be able to help Marie, who needed laboratory space for her research on the magnetic properties of steel. It was a practical meeting between two practical people, and yet something happened in that first conversation that neither of them could fully explain or walk away from. Pierre Curie was not an ordinary man in any sense of the word. He had been something of an outsider in the French scientific establishment for most of his career, a quiet and deeply principled person who cared almost nothing for status or recognition, and almost everything for the purity and honesty of scientific inquiry. He had already done significant work in physics, discovering piezoelectricity with his brother Jacques years earlier, and he had a quality that was extremely rare in the competitive world of science, which was a complete and genuine absence of ego when it came to the work itself. He did not need to be the most important person in the room. He needed to understand the truth about the physical world, and that need, that particular kind of hunger, was something Marie recognized immediately, because she carried exactly the same hunger inside herself. Their relationship grew slowly and with a kind of careful honesty that is rare in any era. Pierre wrote Marie letters of extraordinary openness, telling her that he believed they could do great things together if she was willing to stay in Paris, that he had found in her a mind that matched his in ways he had not encountered before, and that the idea of her returning permanently to Poland felt to him like a genuine loss, not just for him personally but for science itself. Marie hesitated. Poland was her home, her identity, the place her sacrifices had always been pointed toward. And the idea of choosing Paris over Warsaw was not a simple romantic decision, but a deep and complicated question about who she was and what she was truly building her life for. She went back to Poland that summer, tested the possibility of finding a position there, was refused because she was a woman, and returned to Paris. They married in July of 1895 in a ceremony so simple and so deliberately unglamorous that Marie refused to wear a wedding dress, choosing instead a dark blue suit that she could wear afterward in the laboratory. Because for Marie Curie, a dress you could only wear once was a luxury that made no practical sense, and practicality was one of her deepest and most consistent forms of self-expression. What they built together in the years that followed was not the kind of partnership that the world usually celebrates in love stories. It was not built on grand gestures or beautiful words, but on shared hours in the laboratory, on conversations that lasted until midnight about the nature of matter and energy, and the invisible forces holding the universe together, on a mutual respect so deep and so complete that it functioned like a kind of gravity between them. And here's what their partnership teaches you about the people you choose to surround yourself with. Because this lesson is not just about romance. It is about every relationship in your life, every friendship, every collaboration, every person you allow into the inner circle of your ambition. Pierre did not try to slow Marie down. He did not feel threatened by her intelligence, or her drive, or her refusal to be ordinary. He accelerated her. He believed in her work, sometimes even more vocally than she believed in it herself. And she did exactly the same for him. And together they became something neither of them could have been alone, which is perhaps the most important thing two people can ever become for each other. Because the question you need to ask about the people closest to you right now is not whether they make you comfortable, but whether they make you more, and whether you are brave enough to let them. There is a version of scientific discovery that the world loves to tell. A version full of sudden moments of genius, of lightning bolt revelations, of lone, brilliant minds, standing in laboratories, having dramatic realizations that change everything in a single instant. And that version is almost always a lie. A comfortable and exciting lie that we tell because the truth is far less dramatic and far more demanding and far more instructive for anyone who is actually trying to build something real in their own life. The truth of how Marie and Pierre Curie changed the world looks nothing like that romantic version. It looks like years of repetitive, exhausting, unglamorous physical labor in conditions that were genuinely dangerous, performed with a patience and a consistency that most people would find impossible to sustain for a week, let alone for the years it actually required. After their marriage, Marie needed a subject for her doctoral thesis, which would make her the first woman in France to earn a doctorate in physics, and she chose to investigate a phenomenon that a French physicist named Henri Becquerel had recently discovered almost by accident. The fact that uranium emitted rays of an unknown nature that could penetrate solid objects and expose photographic plates without any external source of energy. The scientific establishment had noted this discovery and largely moved on, considering it interesting but not central. And that collective shrug was one of the greatest mistakes in the history of science, because Marie looked at Becquerel's observation and felt something that the others apparently did not feel, which was the particular excitement of a mind that recognizes a door behind which something enormous is waiting. She began measuring the ionizing power of uranium rays with extraordinary precision, using an instrument that Pierre and his brother had invented years earlier. And almost immediately she made her first great original discovery, which was that the intensity of the radiation was directly proportional to the amount of uranium present in the sample and was not affected by the chemical state of the uranium or by external conditions like light or temperature. This meant something profound and revolutionary. It meant that the radiation was coming from the atom itself, from something inside the fundamental structure of matter, and not from any chemical interaction between atoms. She had identified, without yet fully knowing it, a property of matter that would eventually require an entirely new understanding of what matter actually is, and she gave this property a name that she invented herself. She called it radioactivity. Pierre recognized immediately that what Marie had found was far too large for one person to investigate alone, and he set aside his own research entirely to join her, a decision that speaks volumes about his character and about the nature of their partnership. Because abandoning your own work to support someone else's vision requires a particular kind of greatness that has nothing to do with ego and everything to do with understanding what truly matters. Together they worked in a converted shed behind the School of Physics, a space that a visiting German scientist later described as a cross between a stable and a potato cellar with a leaking roof, dirt floors, and no proper ventilation. And in that shed, handling radioactive materials with their bare hands day after day, breathing in radioactive dust without any protection, because no one yet understood what radioactivity was doing to living tissue. They processed literally tons of pitchblende, or searching, for the unknown elements responsible for the extraordinary levels of radiation Marie had detected. In July of 1898, they announced the discovery of a new element, which Marie named polonium, after her beloved and erased homeland. And in December of that same year, they announced the discovery of a second new element, radium. And both of those announcements sent a current through the scientific world that has never fully stopped moving. Because what Marie and Pierre had found in that leaking shed, with their burned and damaged hands, in their ruined coats, after years of work that most people would have abandoned long before the finish line, was not just two new elements on the periodic table, but an entirely new understanding of the invisible architecture of the universe itself. And the question that Chet is asking you, even now, even today, is whether you are willing to do the repetitive, painful, patient work that the thing you say you want actually requires. There is a particular kind of pain that successful people rarely talk about openly. A pain that has nothing to do with failure and everything to do with success. The pain of achieving something extraordinary and then watching the world around you work very hard to find reasons why that achievement does not quite count, why it needs an asterisk, why the credit belongs somewhere else, or to someone else. And Marie Curie knew that pain with an intimacy and a depth that should make every person who has ever been dismissed or diminished or deliberately overlooked feel seen and understood, and far less alone in their own private frustration, because the world did not simply open its arms and celebrate her when the discoveries of polonium and radium became known. The world did what it has always done to people who do not fit the image of who is supposed to be great. It questioned her. In 1903, Marie Curie, together with Pierre and Henry Becquerel, was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics, and the story of how that prize almost did not include her name is one of the most important and instructive stories in the entire history of science. The initial nomination from the French Academy of Sciences included only Pierre and Becquerel, and it was Pierre himself, upon learning this, who wrote to the Nobel Committee, insisting that his wife's contributions were not secondary or supportive, but absolutely central and foundational to the work being recognized, that without Marie's original hypothesis, her original measurements, her original identification of radioactivity as an atomic property, there was no discovery to award at all. The committee reconsidered and added her name, making her the first woman in history to receive a Nobel Prize. But the fact that her name had to be fought for, that it was not there automatically, tells you everything you need to know about the environment she was navigating every single day. The French Academy of Sciences, that great and ancient institution, would not allow Marie to become a member regardless of her Nobel Prize, regardless of her discoveries, regardless of her doctoral degree, regardless of any credential or achievement she could possibly present, because she was a woman, and the rules were clear, and the men who held the rules were not interested in examining them. She received more votes than her male competitor in the election for membership, and still was not admitted. And she never was admitted during her entire lifetime. Not after the first Nobel Prize. Not after the second. Not after any of the extraordinary things she accomplished in the decades that followed. And the Academy did not admit its first female member until 1979, which was 45 years after Marie Curie died. Let that number sit with you for a moment. 45 years. What do you do with a wall that will not move? What do you do when the system is not broken, but is in fact working exactly as the people in power designed it to work? Specifically, to exclude people like you. Marie Curie's answer to that question was not rage, although rage would have been completely justified, and it was not despair, although despair would have been completely understandable. Her answer was continuation. She continued working. She continued publishing. She continued discovering. She refused to allow the smallness of the institution to set the ceiling for the size of her contribution, because she understood something that takes most people a lifetime to learn, which is that the people who refuse to recognize your worth are not the judges of your worth. And waiting for their approval before you proceed is the most expensive mistake you can possibly make with the one life you have been given. She gave lectures across Europe and in the United States to audiences that were overwhelmed by her precision and her quiet authority, and the sheer weight of what she knew. And in 1906, something happened that would have ended most people entirely. Something so sudden and so brutal that it rearranged the entire landscape of her life in a single terrible afternoon. Something that proved that the universe does not pause its cruelty for people who are already carrying more than their share. And the way Marie Curie responded to that moment is perhaps the most powerful and the most heartbreaking chapter of everything she ever lived through, because it asked her to do the one thing that grief makes almost impossible, which is to keep going when the reason you were going has suddenly and violently disappeared. On the 19th of April, 1906, Pierre Curie walked across a street in Paris in the rain, distracted, lost in thought, the way brilliant and absorbed people often are, and he slipped beneath the wheels of a horse-drawn wagon and was killed instantly. And with that single terrible moment, the most important scientific partnership of the age ended without warning, without preparation. Without any of the gradual goodbyes that we tell ourselves we will have when the people we love are taken from us. Marie was told the news at home, and the accounts of people who were with her that day describe a woman who went completely silent in a way that was more frightening than any amount of tears. A silence that comes not from the absence of feeling, but from feeling so much that the ordinary instruments of human expression simply stop functioning altogether. She was 38 years old, a widow, a mother of 2 young daughters, and the person who had understood her most completely in the world was gone. What grief asks of a person in those first weeks and months is almost impossible to describe to someone who has not felt it, because it is not just emotional pain in the way that ordinary sadness is emotional pain. It is a complete reorganization of reality, a sudden and violent removal of the architecture that your daily life was built upon. And everything that was once automatic and natural becomes strange and effortful and wrong. Marie wrote in her private journal during those months, writing directly to Pierre, as though he could still read her words, describing her days with a raw and unbearable honesty that she showed to almost no one. And those journal entries reveal a woman who was not holding herself together so much as she was choosing, minute by minute and hour by hour, to remain standing, when every instinct she had was telling her to collapse and stay down. The University of Paris offered her Pierre's professorship, making her the first woman ever to hold a professorship at that institution. And she accepted it, and the lecture hall on the day of her first class was filled far beyond its normal capacity with students and journalists and members of the public who had come to witness something historic. And Marie walked in and began her lecture at exactly the point in the curriculum where Pierre had stopped. Without ceremony, without introduction, without any acknowledgement of the magnitude of what she was doing. Just the work, just the science, just the continuation of a mission that death had interrupted but could not end. And the room was so moved by that quiet act of defiance against grief that people wept openly while she spoke. But grief was not finished with her yet, because the world, which had already taken her husband and tried to take her recognition, decided in 1911 to take something else. Her reputation, through a campaign of public humiliation so vicious and so personal that it stands as one of the ugliest episodes in the history of science. A French newspaper published the accusation that Marie was involved in a romantic relationship with a fellow physicist named Paul Langevin, a married man, and the story exploded across the French press with a particular savagery that was reserved specifically for her, because she was foreign, because she was a woman, because success in a woman has always attracted a special category of fury from people who believe that success has an address, and that address is not hers. Crowds gathered outside her home shouting insults. She received death threats. Scientists she had known for years turned away from her in public. And it was in the middle of this storm, while the newspapers were printing her name like a crime, while her personal life was being dissected and judged and weaponized against her, that the Nobel Committee sent her the letter informing her that she had been awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for the discovery of radium and polonium, making her the first person in history, man or woman, to win 2 Nobel Prizes in 2 different sciences. And some members of the committee wrote to her privately suggesting that, given the scandal, it might be better if she did not attend the ceremony in person. And Marie Curie wrote back and told them that the prize had been awarded for scientific work, and that her scientific work had nothing to do with her private life, and that she would be attending. And she went, and she stood on that stage, and she accepted that prize with the full weight of everything she was carrying. And the world, whether it was ready to admit it or not, was witnessing something it had never seen before and would not see again for a very long time. There is a moment in certain extraordinary lives when the person stops being only a scientist or only an artist or only a leader and becomes something larger and more permanent, when the work they are doing stops being personal and becomes a gift to the entire human species. And for Marie Curie, that moment came not in a laboratory or on a stage in Stockholm, but on the roads of northern France during the First World War, in a converted vehicle that she had designed and built and driven herself, carrying X-ray equipment to field hospitals so that surgeons could see inside the bodies of wounded soldiers and locate bullets and shrapnel and broken bones without cutting blindly through living flesh. She was 46 years old. She had already won 2 Nobel Prizes. She had already survived grief and scandal and institutional exclusion, and she was driving herself through active war zones. Because she had looked at the scale of human suffering around her and decided that everything she knew had to be put immediately in service of reducing it, she developed a fleet of mobile radiography units that became known among French soldiers as Petits Curies, little Curies, vehicles that could be driven directly to the front lines and set up quickly near surgical stations so that the wounded did not have to be transported long distances before receiving critical imaging. She trained 150 women to operate these units, partly because the men who would normally have been trained were fighting and dying in the trenches, and partly because Marie Curie had never needed a gender requirement to tell her what a person was capable of learning and doing. By the end of the war, her mobile units and the fixed radiological installations she had helped establish had performed over 1 million X-ray examinations on wounded soldiers, and the number of lives saved by that work is genuinely impossible to calculate because it is so large and so diffuse that no single accounting could ever fully capture it. After the war, she returned to the Radium Institute in Paris that she had fought for years to establish, a research institution dedicated entirely to the study of radioactivity and its applications in medicine and physics. And she ran it with the same combination of scientific rigor and human urgency that had characterized everything she had ever done. She raised money for the institute by traveling to the United States twice, where she was received with a level of public adoration that bordered on the extraordinary. Thousands of people turning out to see her, newspapers covering her every movement, President Harding presenting her personally with a gram of radium that had been purchased through a public fundraising campaign, organized by American women who understood, even if their own institutions did not, that they were in the presence of one of the greatest minds their civilization had ever produced. She was uncomfortable with the adoration, deeply uncomfortable, because fame had always felt to her like a distraction from the only thing that actually mattered, which was the work. She also did something in those final decades of her life that is perhaps less celebrated than her scientific achievements, but is in many ways just as remarkable, which is that she raised and educated and inspired her daughter Irene in the same atmosphere of scientific seriousness and human purpose that had shaped her own life. And Irene Joliot Curie would go on to win her own Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1935 alongside her husband, Pierre, making the Curie family the most decorated scientific family in history, a fact that speaks not just to genetics but to the invisible and enormously powerful inheritance of seeing from childhood what a life devoted entirely, something true and difficult and important, actually looks like from the inside. Marie's own body was quietly paying the price for decades of unprotected work with radioactive materials, her hands permanently scarred and damaged, her eyesight deteriorating, her blood slowly being destroyed by the invisible rays she had spent her life studying, without ever fully understanding what they were doing to her at the cellular level. And she knew her health was failing. But she continued working, continued showing up to the institute, continued supervising research and writing, and contributing to a field that she had essentially invented with her own intelligence in her own hands. Because for Marie Curie, stopping was never truly an option that the mind she carried was capable of seriously considering. And the question of what she was building, what she was leaving behind, what the sum of all those years of pain and sacrifice and work actually added up to, was about to receive its final and most permanent answer. Marie Curie died on the 4th of July, 1934, in a small sanatorium in the French Alps. And the cause of death was aplastic anemia, a destruction of the bone marrow's ability to produce blood cells, caused by decades of exposure to the radioactive materials she had discovered, studied, and carried with her everywhere she went, materials so saturated into the fabric of her life that her personal notebooks, her cookbooks, her furniture, the very clothes she wore during her years of research, are still stored today in lead-lined boxes in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris and will remain radioactive for another 1,500 years, which means that Marie Curie's work is still literally present in the physical world, still emitting energy, still impossible to touch without protection, still demanding respect and caution from anyone who comes near it, long after the woman herself has been gone for nearly a century. She was buried quietly beside Pierre in a small cemetery outside Paris, and 60 years later the French government made the decision to move both of their remains to the Pantheon, the great mausoleum in Paris where France buries the people it considers its most important and most beloved. And Marie Curie became the first woman ever to enter the Pantheon on her own merits, not as someone's wife or someone's mother, but as herself, as a scientist, as a discoverer, as a human being who had taken the one life she was given and used every single particle of it in service of understanding and in service of others. And that ceremony, that final recognition, came 60 years after her death, which means that even in the end, the world was slow to fully say what needed to be said, and she had to wait the way she had always waited, with the patience of someone who knew that the truth does not disappear simply because the people in power are not ready to acknowledge it. She was born in a country that did not exist, educated in secret, dismissed because of her gender, robbed of credit she had earned, publicly humiliated at the height of her power, physically destroyed by the very work that made her immortal. And she won 2 Nobel Prizes, discovered 2 elements, saved over 1 million lives on the battlefields of a world war, built an institution that continues to fight cancer today, and raised a daughter who carried her legacy forward into the next generation of human knowledge. And she did all of that not because the world made it easy, not because the conditions were favorable, not because anyone handed her a clear path and said, "Here, this is yours," but because she decided, somewhere deep in the bones of who she was, that the size of the obstacle was not a reason to stop, but a measure of how important the thing on the other side truly was. So now, the question comes back to you, and it comes back with the full weight of everything you have just heard, with the full weight of the frozen attic, and the leaking shed, and the burned hands, and the newspapers printing a name like a crime in the Nobel stage, and the war roads and the lead-lined notebooks still radioactive, in their boxes in Paris. The question is not whether you have what it takes, because Marie Curie did not know she had what it took either. Not at 17 working as a governess, not at 24 eating bread in a freezing room, not at 38 standing in silence while the world told her that her husband was gone. She found out she had what it took by refusing to stop, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one quiet and unglamorous act of continuation after another. You have been given a life, not a rehearsal, not a draft, not a practice round before the real thing begins. This is the real thing, right now, today. And somewhere inside you there is a version of yourself that is still waiting in the cold, still sending money home, still studying in secret, still believing in something that the world around you has not yet learned to see. And that version of you deserves the same answer that Maria Sklodowska gave herself in Warsaw in 1880. For when the door was locked, and the system said no, and the future was uncertain, and the only thing she had was the fire, which is this: I am not finished. I have not even started. The world has not seen what I am capable of yet, and neither have I. The clock is running. Do not waste another day waiting for permission that was never coming. Rise.